There's a moment in Blueprints that most players will experience. The moment when you realize that the game's title is actually a play on words, a pun, because Blueprints sounds like blueprints, as in the blueprints that you're using to draft the rooms of the mansion as you play. And then, if you stick with the game, if you get drawn into the ever-changing maze of puzzles and mysteries that lurk inside the rooms of Mount Holly, you'll likely experience another moment in Blueprints. The moment when you realize that the game's title is also a political statement within the context of the game's narrative. Blueprints takes place in a nation that has been known by different names, originally as Orindia, then as Orinda Ares, and finally as Fen Ares, after a brutal civil war during which the current regime rose to power. And because each of these eras in the nation's history are associated with specific colors, making certain comments about these colors can be a politically charged statement that can be not only controversial, but also potentially dangerous. Blueprints took the gaming world by storm seemingly out of nowhere after its release, in big part due to the very unique and creative design ideas that it presents. The game is built around some unconventional yet extremely compelling game mechanics that push the very boundaries of what we traditionally conceive of as a puzzle game. In addition to this, Blueprints also follows in the steps of other titles such as Animal Well by creating an experience that contains a seemingly endless number of layers upon layers of secrets, a massive puzzle box that continues to reveal more and more hidden mysteries at every turn. You can spend more than 100 hours exploring the spaces of the game even after reaching room 46 and rolling credits, and you might still not find everything the game is hiding underneath the surface, and people have done exactly that. As such, it shouldn't come as a surprise to learn that Blueprints approaches its narrative elements in the same way, which is to say that the story of Blueprints is fragmented into a myriad pieces that are scattered throughout the many rooms of the game, and is up to the player to piece together the underlying story as they slowly unravel the many mysteries of Mount Holly. Because of this, the story of Blueprints, as well as its overarching narrative, is extremely ambiguous and hard to interpret. We only get small glimpses of it here and there, glimpses that convey not a grounded, concrete and logical plot, but that instead serve to color the underlying emotional narrative, as well as the themes at the center of the story. However, I believe that the game's ambiguous approach to its story elements is not simply a meaningless gimmick, but rather, the game's structure is crafted with intent to explore ideas that are so pervasive they have the power to seep into our daily lives and twist even the most mundane of things. Ideas such as oppression, fascism, death, and the process of grieving. To be clear, this is not a quote-unquote story explained video, nor is this a lore video in which I attempt to take the game's narrative and turn it into a neat and coherent timeline of events. I'm not really concerned with the specific details of the game's lore and how they fit into place. No, the reason that I ultimately find Blueprints' approach to narrative so fascinating is because the game uses its structure and its game mechanics, its very building blocks, to explore the theme of fascism in a way that reminds me of the authors that I grew up reading. Now, I should say, for full disclosure, that at this point, I'm still in the process of trying to unravel the many mysteries of Blueprints. I've been having a lot of fun with the game, and I've been trying to avoid any spoilers whatsoever. As such, my interpretation of the game's story might be flawed or incomplete. I'm not entirely sure if the theme of fascism is, in fact, a central element to the narrative of Blueprints, or if I just see fascism everywhere now because I'm living in a country that is very quickly slipping into a fascist state. Still, exploring fascism in literature is an act that I am familiar with, as I grew up reading Latin American fiction, which has always been concerned with exploring ideas such as fascism and oppression. And specifically, there is one book that constantly came to my mind while playing Blueprints, and I want to tell you about it because it is one of the most fascinating books I've ever attempted to read. And I say attempted because I've never been actually able to finish the book. Published in 1969, Conversation in the Cathedral is a novel written by Mario Vargas Llosa set in Peru during the dictatorship of Manuel Arturo Odría. The novel revolves around a chance meeting between Santiago Zavala, a young journalist who is also the son of a wealthy businessman with ties to the fascist government, and Ambrosio, who worked for Santiago's father as a driver and has knowledge of some of the government's secrets. As the two men catch up over drinks at a bar called The Cathedral, Santiago attempts to uncover the truth behind his father's role in the murder of a prominent cabaret singer. Now, beyond this simple opening premise, I could give you a summary of the story. I could tell you the names of the characters in the book, of which there are many. I could tell you about the actions that these characters perform, the conversations they have, and the events that take place throughout the plot, and this would give you the impression that this is just like any other book out there. But if you actually sat down and attempted to read through this novel, you'd find this to be a very difficult task, mainly due to the unconventional structure that Vargas Llosa employs to tell this story. Basically, the timeline of the book is not chronological, but rather the story is fragmented into a myriad events that we experience through the many conversations that take place between various characters, with the central conversation taking place between Santiago and Ambrosio at the cathedral, serving as a spine that connects all of the other branching events, creating what is essentially one massive and incredibly complex conversation that spans many years and involves many different characters. In other words, the novel constantly jumps between the central conversation at the cathedral and other conversations taking place at different times and places in the story, a structure that perhaps might not seem that strange to modern readers. However, the problem is that these jumps are so jarring at times that you are left confused and scrambling to figure out who is speaking to who and where and when at any given moment. And sometimes, the conversations taking place in the book are juxtaposed to one another so chaotically that you might not even realize that the timeline has already jumped to a different place or a different moment in time. A line of dialogue taking place between two specific characters in a conversation, for example, can be immediately followed by a new line of dialogue taking place months later in a different place between two completely different characters with no real sign that a change has occurred at all, leaving the reader disoriented and having to piece together the many events of the overall story. Thus, the act of reading conversation in the cathedral is the act of untangling the counterpoint of conversations taking place within the larger narrative of the book to piece together the overarching story. To me, this unconventional structure of the book is meant to be a symbol for fascism, and more specifically, the way fascism is so pervasive it can seep into even the smallest spaces of everyday life, its corruption spreading as people interact with one another, creating an interconnected web that is impossible to untangle, yet one that people still need to learn how to navigate. And, in fact, Vargas Llosa himself has spoken about this very fact. In Conversation in Princeton, a book that serves as a transcript of a seminar held by Vargas Llosa in Princeton, the author says that his intent with this book was to explore the ways in which the corruption of a totalitarian government can penetrate even the smallest spaces of a city, how it can infiltrate the private lives of people and then taint or destroy their interpersonal relationships. In other words, Vargas Llosa employs the very structure of the novel to show how life under the corruption of fascism becomes a twisted labyrinth where the rooms are always changing, and truth is something that you must learn to piece together out of small fragments and clues you find scattered around. And at this point, the parallel should be obvious, but the more and more that I delved into Blueprints, the more the game reminded me of Conversation in the Cathedral. In the novel, the very building blocks of the text, the lines of dialogue themselves, shift around as you read, moving from room to room, even as the characters present in the scene change too. In Blueprints, the rooms of Mount Holly themselves are the literal building blocks of the gameplay, which you arrange as you play each run. And, as is the case with Conversation in the Cathedral, I believe there is a narrative meaning behind Blueprints' game mechanics. Now, as I said before, the narrative of Blueprints is ambiguous and hard to follow, but the traces of fascism are there if you look closely. Once you make it to the library, for example, you are able to check out books. The first time I got there, I checked out a book titled The History of Our India because I wanted to learn more about the backstory of the game. After opening the book, however, I was greeted by a red seal that states that this book has been reviewed and cleared for publication by the Fen Aries Board of Education. And if you continue to leaf through the book, you'll find that a lot of the text has been censored, with entire sentences and paragraphs being completely blacked out. This is something that Vargas Llosa himself, who worked as a journalist during the dictatorship of Odría, experienced firsthand, as he recounts that any international news story had to be approved by the government before being published. It is only when you unlock the bookstore in Blueprints that you are able to obtain a first edition of the book, and you can learn more about the actual history of Orindia. Another moment that struck me as creepy is when you first enter the classroom, where you can find a few tests that were presumably left there by students. And if you look at these tests, you can see that apparently every single child there answered that their favorite color is red, which is, of course, the color associated with the current regime of Fen Aries. These small details stood out to me as a possible symbol for the indoctrination taking place in public schools under a totalitarian government. Then, when you unlock the shelter, you discover that Mount Holly was being used as a safe haven for someone being hunted down by the Royal Guard, which gives the changing rooms of Mount Holly a different kind of symbolism, as the spaces of the house itself become a kind of maze used to confuse and evade the forces of the government, which, of course, immediately brings to mind Germany during World War II. And yet, the most interesting aspect of the story of Blueprints has to do with the character of Mary Jones, Simon's mother, who disappeared a few years prior to the events of the game. Just as Santiago Zavala is trying to piece together a mystery involving his father in conversation in the cathedral, both Simon and the player begin to piece together the story of Simon's mother and her potential involvement in a crime. However, unlike Santiago's father, who has ties with the dictatorship of Odría, Simon's mother seems to be part of an activist group that was involved in the theft of a set of royal jewels, a heist committed as an act of defiance against the government of Fen Aries. As we explore the rooms of Mount Holly, we learn that at some point Mary was detained and questioned by the Red Guard, and that she was suspected to have ties with an activist group, which led to her being dropped by her book publisher. We also learned that Mary, who is an award-winning author of children's books, was forced to change the ending of her book, The Red Prince, for being too political. Eventually, once you reach Chamber 46, you encounter what I believe is meant to be the original ending of Red Prince during the final cutscene of the game. In addition to this, you can also find another of Mary's books, Swimbird, as you explore the house. And the thing that becomes apparent after reading these books is that Mary seems to be writing against fascism and oppression in her work. Swimbird is about a bird who loves to swim instead of flying in the sky. Other birds are not happy about this, however, and they shame the main bird into conforming. By the end of the book, the bird is afraid to do anything that might make him stand out. A poignant end that is meant to symbolize the way freedom of thought and action cannot be tolerated in a totalitarian society. In Red Prince, we follow a small boy who loves the color red. In fact, the color red seems to be the child's entire identity, and yet the child is depicted as being sad, close to the world, afraid to even look at the sky, and unable to take in the joys that exist around him. A clear symbolism for the way in which conforming to fascism erodes one's humanity. In the original ending of the book, however, the boy decides to throw away his love of the color red and finds a new color to love, which, I think, is meant as a metaphor for the dismantling of the rule of Fen Aries and a hopeful move towards a new and better future. All of this points to the fact that Mary was an activist, someone who was clearly set in fighting against the regime of Fen Aries, and later, as we uncover the secret letters hidden away under lock in the estate, we learn that she was indeed part of the activist group that stole the crown's jewels, as is implied by the rubies we find next to these letters. Mary was forced to go into hiding, but she had planned for Simon to follow her sometime later. Since that never came to pass, it is unclear as to what happened to her, at least up to the point that I am in the story. I'm not sure if Mary is dead or alive somewhere still in hiding, but I think that this ambiguity is actually kind of the point. Something that I find fascinating about Conversation in Princeton is that some of the things that Vargas Llosa says during this seminar about his book Conversation in the Cathedral are things that could very well be applied to Blue Prince. Despite the fact that Blue Prince was critically acclaimed upon release, a lot of the discussions happening about this game seem to be extremely polarizing. Many people seem to have found the game's mechanics too frustrating and incoherent, its puzzles too obtuse, its scope too overwhelming, its story too unclear and ambiguous. And some of these same criticisms were said about Conversation in the Cathedral decades before. Conversation in the Cathedral was both praised and criticized for being too hard to read. The book is inherently inaccessible and demands a lot from the reader. This is not a book that you sit down to read for fun, but as Vargas Llosa points out, the difficulty of the book is not simply an aesthetic choice, but rather it was born out of necessity when trying to represent a complex reality. The point of the structure of the book is to represent a society where people's lives are twisted by fascism down to the smallest mundane details. And I believe that, similarly, Blue Prince employs its structure and its game mechanics with intent in order to represent a complex reality that transcends logical understanding. In Blue Prince, the shifting rooms of Mount Holly come to symbolize the lives of people under an oppressive government, a government where free thinking is not allowed, where books are banned and history revised. Fascism seeps into the very spaces of mundane life and twists them. People's lives become an ever-changing labyrinth that they need to learn to navigate, a maze where the truth needs to be pieced together slowly from small fragments scattered around. This is a place where the lives of people can change in a moment, where the house you knew can take a new shape the very next day. This is a place where a boy's mother can disappear without a trace and, well, what is grief but the distortion of the spaces that you once found familiar? What is fascism but the realization that the structures that support the very spaces that we inhabit and which we take for granted can shift under our feet at any moment, leaving us disoriented and scrambling to make sense of the narrative thread that took us here? As I said in the beginning, everything I've discussed about Blue Prince here is based on my own interpretation of the game's underlying narrative. It is based on my understanding of the story up to the point that I'm currently at in the game's progression. Usually, when I make a video about a game, I try to do some research on it, even if it's just to make sure that my understanding of the game is not way off or that I'm not missing or misinterpreting a key element of the story. But Blue Prince is a very open-ended game, and it's not easy to look up information about it without coming across spoilers. The truth is that I'm still very much enjoying the process of trying to uncover as many secrets as I can by myself, until the inevitable moment when I'll no doubt end up spending a couple of evenings going down a Blue Prince rabbit hole. In other words, I'm still at a point when I'm trying to unravel this fascinating game without outside help, and as such, part of my understanding and interpretation of the game could be flawed or just straight up wrong. But if that's the case, then I'm okay with that because that's part of the journey of this game. There's a moment in Vargas Llosa's seminar that I find fascinating, in which he literally compares the story of Conversation in the Cathedral to a puzzle that the reader slowly puts together in their minds piece by piece as they untangle the many threads of the overarching narrative. Vargas Llosa goes on to say that he was never concerned about the story being too confusing, but that, in fact, the confusing and inaccessible quality of the novel was an essential part of it, one that is meant to push the reader to contribute in an active way to the unfolding of the story. Sometimes, within the medium of games, people get too caught up when a game's story is too ambiguous or inaccessible, but the beauty of games in general is that they are inherently built on the active participation that the player has in creating an overall narrative comprised of both story and gameplay elements, what we now call emergent storytelling. Games can do effortlessly what Vargas Llosa was trying to do with his experimental novel in the 60s, and that's awesome. That's one of the reasons I love video games so much. And ultimately, I can find no better metaphor for the idea of living within a fascist society than the one contained within the structures of both Conversation in the Cathedral and Blue Prince. Because, as we are learning under the Trump administration in the US, one of the things fascism hates the most is when you look critically at the narratives around you, when you untangle them, deconstruct them, when you gather the fragmented pieces of truth hidden within them and use them to expose the ultimate truth, that fascism is, in the end, nothing but a house that has been twisted into a maze where the rooms are ever changing.